My name is Olivia,
I'm Joey.
and welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Nothing in My Brain. So, today we're honored to have Mrinal Gokhale, a South Asian American and neurodivergent author and advocate for mental health. Okay, so again, thank you for taking the time to join our podcast and be a part of this interview. And so to start off the episode, could you start by introducing a little bit about yourself and your background to all our viewers?
Sure. So my name is Mrinal Gokhale, and I'm an author of two books about South Asian mental health. And I am also a former journalist and marketing professional, and currently work as a data analyst full time as well. And since becoming published, I also have become a public speaker to talk about neurodiversity, disability, and mental health in the South Asian and Asian American diasporas.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
so you talk about growing up like South Asian. So how did that shape your understanding of mental health when you were a child?
I would say that I had little understanding of it. I'm born in 1990, and so that's number one. And basically, I think in the South Asian community, I think anyone will tell you that in a lot of communities of color, the concept of mental health is considered a whispered about topic that's been swept under the rug and so on and so forth. In Based on what I grew up with specifically, yes, it was rarely talked about. I had a brother that was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2, yet I had lots of social emotional learning difficulties as well as academic difficulties, and it was all chalked up to I'm not trying hard enough. And I had to be the one to pursue therapy for myself at the age of 20. And I think that the stigma behind it was very much amplified by the model minority myth. I grew up in a white American suburb of Milwaukee, the most segregated city in the country. I can count on one hand the number of South Asian children that I went to school with. And however, my family was connected to a larger South Asian community from like the temple that we went to, for example. And I felt like all South Asian families that I encountered fell into kind of like the check boxes of what encompasses the model minority myth. And that further amplified my lack of education around mental health as well as that of my family.
So, do you mind maybe explaining a little bit about what the model minority myth is for those who may not know?
Sure, it's the false ideology that certain groups of people are effortlessly and unequivocally successful, specifically when it comes to Asian Americans. For example, I guess I can only speak for South Asians. A lot of people, when they think of a South Asian American, they'll picture someone who works in STEM,
Yeah.
someone who, so science, technology, engineering, math, and someone who those kinds of stereotypes make people think that other people of color need to just get their stuff together and be more like them, so to speak. And I think that where it's a positive stereotype, quote unquote, in the sense that it drives notions in people that all Asians are smart and this and that. My mother once told me that I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and basically, she told me when we moved into a house there when I was little, the neighbor said something to her like, I rarely see news stories about Indian people going to jail or something along those lines. And then she said something like, well, we have to, get good jobs to come to this country to get green card and sponsorship type thing. So
Mhm.
basically, to answer your questions, it's those stereotypes.
Yes, definitely. And I think we definitely feel it too. It's like there's a lot of pressure on us. I'm not sure if I made it clear, but we're from the Bay Area. And so
Okay.
that's a
Where all
very,
the Asians are.
yeah. So we definitely feel that stereotype as well. Okay, so the next question is, how has your culture influenced personal conversations around mental health? Like this can be in your community or home, or the way you express yourself emotionally.
So as I mentioned before, the conversations were never had growing up. And I think that being a millennial in the elder generations, what I witness is that people, first of all, don't know the difference between mental health and mental illness, in that they don't understand that every human being has physical health, every human being has mental health. We don't all have mental illnesses, so to speak, quote unquote illnesses, right? And then I think that too, there's with that comes the myth that, for example, that your child going to therapy means that you have failed them. That going to therapy is only for people who suffer with something like schizophrenia. Like the idea of having mental health challenges is equates, what you might see on the distorted television perceptions of mental health and illnesses, such as something like schizophrenia or something very sensational, so to speak, and that these things make you unmarriageable, they make you unemployable, unable to provide for yourself or someone else in life type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is, in your experience, how does the South Asian community approach the topic of mental health and therapy?
Um, so I think that So I think this goes back to how the stigma in the elder generations particularly makes it so that a lot of mental health challenges are swept under the rug and not treated in yourself and as well as the generations after you, causing a lot of intergenerational trauma. In my book, you will see themes like, parents not taking their kids' mental health seriously until their symptoms and challenges get to a highly severe level, for example, is a common theme. I think in the millennial and younger generation, things like therapy is getting embraced much more heavily and being able to have these conversations too. And I think that things like COVID particularly made it so that people in the South Asian community finally started to talk. And I think that's because of things like COVID, the pandemic amplifying things like loneliness, depression, domestic violence, unemployment, and all these other things that can lead to challenges in one's mental health. So basically I think it's very much a generational type of difference, although, the stigma is still there in all generations and we still do have some ways to go to reducing the stigma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So why do you think that like the conversation around mental health and mental illnesses are seen as like taboo in society?
I think that it depends which society you talk to, but as a whole, I think that somehow the notion that having mental health challenges makes you weak and that you should use your willpower to overcome it, so to speak, started everywhere somehow. And then number two, I think that, it could be distrust of white institutions, which when you think about it, some may say the DSM-5 at its core is ableist and colonial. Why? Because it makes it seem as though, one type of functioning neurologically is superior to that of the others. It values degrees over lived experiences. It uses terms like ill and disordered as opposed to seeing, human brains as just as equally diverse as other aspects of humanity, like race and culture and religion and so on and so forth. And so I think that, while I do agree that Western psychology has colonial origins and can come across as excessively pathologizing, I'm not going to say that it doesn't have a place whatsoever. And I think that too, now there's more knowledge that there's different types of therapy out there, which is something that I think the elder generations, just as much as people that are younger than them, should be learning and educating themselves on as well. And I think that, in Asian communities as a whole, then also there's the concept of collectivism. Collectivism isn't all bad. It's rooted in ancestral wisdom. It may not always teach you to live your life, how to live your life today and onwards. But I think that it may make people think that, it's the family's job to fix their child and no one else's, for example. And then in South Asian communities, there's the slang "lo kya kahenge," which means "what will people think?" And I do think that those sorts of mindsets can, cause families to like be in denial about themselves or their kids having mental health related challenges and, embracing the idea of seeking outside help as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you kind of like brought up the history of these mental health terms, like how they're seen as disordered and stuff like that. And so it's also really interesting how you brought up like the mental health slang in your like language. And so I was wondering, are there maybe, could you maybe elaborate more on like how language might play a role in like mental health slang or like kind of, I mean, these words have like a certain connotation to them. So,
Sure. So, yeah, basically, I think that language matters in the sense that, we're attempting to change how our language now around mental health. And for example, people say, you should use words let's like died by suicide rather than committing suicide because the term committing makes it sound like, a bad act. And then there's the notion of challenging terms like mentally ill and disordered and instead, trying to look at it from a more neutral standpoint around, using words like disability, which is, I guess, another debate, or, differences, so to speak, and, making a more accessible society that accepts and, doesn't see one brain type as superior to that of the others based on to what degree they're capable of contributing to capitalism. And, because some may say that, psychiatric drugs are essentially Western tools of productivity that are trying to get you to function in a way that society deems acceptable, quote unquote. So, and what comes from that is, I've met some from the psychosis community that will say, if I understand the difference between what I can see and hear and what other people can't, and these thoughts and voices are not telling me to harm myself or other people. Why should I take sedating, weight gaining drugs that prevent me from working and from just living life in general? Because society thinks I'm a weirdo, for example. Um, and then there's the neurodiversity movement. In 2000, the term neurodiversity was coined by sociologist Judith Singer, who is autistic, that said that we need to see brain types as natural variations rather than disorders and illnesses. And that's kind of a controversy too, because on one hand, while I do like the word neurodivergent and calling myself that, some may argue that psychology is being deduced to TikTok culture in the sense that, you see influencers talking about things like autism and ADHD, and teenagers, for example, may not understand that, you do need to look into the diagnostic manual for these things. You can't just be like, oh, I have trouble concentrating or I have sensitivity to loud noises sometimes. I have autism, I have ADHD, I'm cool too, type of thing.
mhm.
And this came up actually in a conference in the UK that I went to on that was called a Breaking the Stigma conference that was South Asian themed. A professor there, he brought up the concept of stigma and anti-stigma campaigns. And he brought up, the philosophy, how do I see you, seeing me, seeing you? It builds off a philosopher that says that basically the way we see each other is ourselves is dependent on how others see us. And his argument is that the concept of stigma is driven by othering people. So, for example, if I tell you that I'm an Indian American and then you validate, so to give me the validation that you see me as an Indian American, are you also technically othering me? And if I tell you that I'm an autistic and you say that, okay, I see you as an autistic and I see me as an autistic, is that also a form of othering? And if so, is that a contributor to stigma? I agree with that and I don't because I think that his view comes across as kind of medicalized and pathological and kind of, doesn't always consider those that are late diagnosed because they mask so heavily and have hidden their struggles.
Mhm.
Yeah, so definitely you made a lot of very, very great points. So moving on to more towards your personal life. So were you aware of any of your anxiety symptoms or your autistic traits when you were little? And if so, did you ever consider seeking like a mental health professional when you were like a child?
Yes, I could tell that something was different since I was in grade school in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I think that what told me that was things like, so my parents would tell you that when I grew up, as a baby, I was a very verbal talker. I was I had advanced speech language acquisition. I was speaking in complete sentences before the age of 2, allegedly. And then after that age, they started to notice things like hiding my face or crying if asked to say hello to someone. And this transferred to when I would grow up, I wouldn't say hi when someone said it to me for the longest time. And which is a form of social anxiety. And then also when kids would come to my house, to play, they wouldn't return after that. I think that it was seen as anxiety at first and like not talking, but then at some point, I think my parents could sense that it was something a little more than that. But I think again, it's either that denial or lack of education thing. And then also school wise, year after year, I would get in trouble for things like not handing in homework in time unless my parents sat in the same room with me as I was getting done. And then I would miss instructions really easily and not follow directions unless I received like just one or two at a time, or I had a teacher that was willing to repeat it. And I think, the concept of special ed in those years was seen as something you go to only if you're, blind, deaf, cognitively disabled, intellectually disabled, or you have ADHD, or you're all good type of thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so kind of pivoting, um, like we talked about kind of like the stigma of mental health in South Asian communities. So how do you think we can kind of challenge this mentality that is really common in immigrant households?
I think that continue having difficult conversations like this, continue to bring more people of color and marginalized communities into the field because so often, and as you'll read in my book, people will tell you, that they love working with therapists who look like them because they don't have to spend 30 minutes of an hour-long session educating that provider. Why does my family think or act the way that they do? That's a double-edged sword though, because two, I've met some that fear therapists from their culture because they might feel more judged. And I think that, that goes back to how providers need to do more bias checks within themselves so that they don't over-identify emotionally with their clients. And number two, so that they can still acknowledge, how their client grew up, but also be like, you don't have to accept everything that you grew up with if you don't agree with it. You can break the cycle if you want to, so to speak, even if it may not be easy. And let's explore how we do that. And then two, I think that when it comes to the elder generations, I think that it's important to provide therapy or mental health related services in a culturally sensitive manner, in the sense that in a way that reduces language barriers, in a way that honors things like spirituality and holistic health, so to speak, and in a way and that doesn't colonialize their sorts of what they might have been taught when it comes to things like the value of like prayer and religion in one's mental wellness, but also exploring how that can be integrated into a Western model if needed, because therapy is not a one size fits all, and because these days things like somatic therapy is becoming hot, so to speak, and that just leaves so many different options for people to explore, if they have the privilege to access those things, which is, debatable on a governmental level.
Yeah, okay, definitely. I can see what you're saying about like relating to their struggles, especially if you like share their culture.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that you like published two books. So could you maybe explain like how like your books like um explore the stories of like South Asian like communities and how they navigate mental health and what inspired you to write the books that you did?
So I was never intent on becoming an author, but like I said, I was a freelance journalist for several years. And during those years, I would do current events in the community. And I sometimes did mental health awareness month events. And I noticed that those events were being done in the African American and Latino communities, not so much the Asian American. And, since I had, so many struggles growing up but was highly masking and lacked the language and framework to be able to advocate and understand myself and therefore the world and others until I was in my 20s. That's what developed my strong interest in psychology. And I think so. Basically, during COVID, I took a free memoir writing class, and then I learned about self-publishing. And that's when I learned that, people don't have to go through traditional publishers to become published. And I was like, I'd love to publish a book. by before I age out of the age of 30, so I can put it on my 30 by 30 list. And basically, I brainstormed topics of interest to me, and psychology was one thing. And then I was like, it would be interesting to explore mental health in South Asian people because I'm essentially the only South Asian person that I know with a therapy and mental health journey. And I just took a leap of faith. One day looked up South Asian mental health in the Instagram hashtag and Google search bar, and I saw so many more public figures and organizations than I would have ever expected. And that's because that was in the pandemic, I think, that I did it. And then I reached out to them, like, do you know anyone that, would want to share their stories with me, that I write them? And they put out submission calls. People reached out to me. I interviewed them and I wrote their stories. And I published book number one in 4 months on lockdown. And then in 2023, I published book number two because I felt as though there's a lot more stories that needed to be told because a lot of people don't know that there's communities within communities when it comes to Asian communities and even when it comes to I can speak for the South Asian community too. So book number two, I had like more male representation, more non-binary representation, LGBT representation, more diverse experiences and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so you mentioned about all of these like new representation in your second book. So what role do you think that these like representation of these communities play in like helping these people feel more validated?
Help these people what?
Feel more validated. So like yeah.
Well, first, I would say it'll make people, if people feel like they're the only ones, um, maybe the only person in the closet in their community, the only person that in their family that has pursued therapy and doesn't know anyone else in their community that has, and so on and so forth. I think that it will help them to validate their doubts and show them that they're not alone and take comfort in those stories as step number one. And number two, if they ever pursue something like therapy or anything else to for their mental health, they will be able to perhaps use the book as a bridge to guide maybe a provider that does not come from their community to better familiarize themselves with cultural norms as well as the diversity within their community, so to speak. For example, I once was emailed by a reader that said that he was an Indian immigrant and they got into a relationship with a white partner who broke up with them and it was devastating. But then every therapist that in their area that they could access happened to be white. And being able to read my book helped them to gain the courage to have that conversation about the importance of cultural norms and how, culture that they grew up with contributed to their mental health challenges and who they are as human beings, so to speak.
Yeah, that was definitely like a really touching story, and like storytelling definitely holds a lot of power in impacting people. And also just like writing a book, like that's an incredible like accomplishment and feat. So that's really admirable.
Thank
So
you.
I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about your books. And so were there maybe any particular stories that moved you or shifted your perspective?
Yes, there were several. I can't say that I can pick one, but I would say that in book number two is where I read the most variety. It felt good and refreshing to have met so many people, South Asian people from the LGBT community willing to talk, for example, because that wasn't something that I could find in book number one. I like the fact that there were some of those who said that their parents were quite supportive of their coming out. That was another thing that felt refreshing to hear. And then it was also refreshing to hear the stories of people who shared their stories that said that their family was more supportive than other South Asian families that they have seen in their community when it comes to their mental health and wellness and being able to receive a diagnosis and treatment for it. And then I also admire those that are willing to tell the stories of so book number two had more DV related stories in it compared to book number one. So that made me question, are people getting more comfortable talking about it, or is it just a coincidence that I met so many people that are willing to talk about it this time, for example? But I find it really brave that in a culture that, prioritizes what people think and likes to argue that what happens in the house stays in the house when it comes to those sorts of things, that so many people were willing to talk about abuse in book number two, for example.
Yeah, so like talking about how like more people are like sharing like their own stories. So how do you think like the like sharing these stories have an impact on South Asian readers, or how do you think sharing these stories combat like the stigma around mental health in especially the South Asian community?
Well, I think that being able to talk is the first step to deconstructing stigma. And a lot of people will tell you that in my book that regardless to whether or not they use their real names when they told me their stories and I wrote them, that it felt good to talk about it and felt like almost a form of therapy. And some will say that they felt closer to their family as a result of doing the story and talking to them about it. And then also, as we discuss, more people feel feel less alone when they read these sorts of stories and be able to use it to bridge a gap between people from other cultures to teach them what mental health in the South Asian culture presents as.
Mhm. I was just kind of like curious. I was wondering if like your family was very supportive of like your writing journey and kind of like advocating for mental health, and if that like shifted their perspective.
Yes, they were. So they were very excited to tell their friends and family about my book when it was published, both times around. However, I will note that I technically didn't tell my story in the book, so I feel like, in that sense, that technically absolves them of any sense of shame or accountability, so to speak, in comparison to, anyone who says that, their child is writing a book about their own story, so to speak. And I think too, I did see a difference in their level of knowledge about mental health and mental illness as a whole too, as a result of them having read the books.
Okay, that's really interesting.
So our next question is like, how do you think? Well, I think you mentioned it before, like how like some people seek like therapists of their own culture, but how can like mental health professionals better support the South Asian community in like a more culturally like competent way?
I would say that people who are not of South Asian descent should do things like read my book, other people's books, and do as much to educate themselves on South Asian culture and be able to and I think that, even brown therapists, as I mentioned, need to be able to make sure that they don't over-identify with their clients emotionally speaking to the point of projection, and also be able to question within themselves, what toxic cultural norms could I be subconsciously operating on, so to speak? And, how can I encourage my client, validate their experience, but also show them that they don't have to continue intergenerational trauma or cultural traditions and norms that they personally don't agree with.
Yeah, definitely. I think just having an open mind, like diversifying, and also just kind of like recognize your own bias can really help. And so, kind of directing it to our viewers, if you could give a message to like South Asian youth struggling with anxiety, depression, or any other mental health struggles, what would you say?
I would say that you're most definitely not alone, and this is the generation that's finally starting to talk about it. So I think that it would be a lot easier for you to find community than it was for someone like me who was born in 1990. So whether you do it through by talking, by, getting the bravery to talk to your parents about it, they may surprise you, or being able to find your own community within your own school circles or online support groups. Do your best to seek support. It's that simple. And if you're too sheltered to be able to do it right now, then please do it when you're an adult.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And is there any like strategies that you personally use yourself to ensure your own mental health well-being or your own mental wellness?
I've been in therapy for over 10 years of my life, different sorts of providers. I started out with traditional CBT and talk therapy, and that helped initially, but now I've evolved to doing EMDR, which is a somatic type of therapy, and I go at it about once a month now only, and it has been super groundbreakingly helpful. And this is kind of why I developed, the philosophy that there's no one size fits all, and don't be afraid to give multiple modalities a try. And if it doesn't work for you, no one's forcing you to keep on doing it.
Could you maybe elaborate more what EMDR is and how it differs from the other types of therapy you tried?
It stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So basically it's minimal in talk therapy and basically it's trauma memory focused. So basically I'll just say that your provider will pick a negative core belief that lives in your nervous system that's heavily internalized and that you believe emotionally, even if you don't believe it logically, such as I am weak, I am powerless, I am unlovable, and so on and so forth. You pick one and then you you can how I'm doing it is we're treating multiple memories that are associated with that thought starting from childhood. Some people, however, do it for one memory only, such as, let's say an assault or something like that that's giving them PTSD symptoms. But basically, you pick that memory, and then what the therapist will do is use bilateral stimulation-based movements, such as eye movements. So, moving something, whether it's a dot on the screen, if it's virtual, or something else like back and forth, left and right, and your eyes follow it, kind of like putting you in a hypnotic state in a sense. And you do that while visualizing the trauma. And I know that that sounds like pseudoscience for some, but basically the idea is that these eye movements essentially stimulate both hemispheres of the brain, whereas talk therapy only stimulates the verbal part of the brain. This stimulates the nonverbal part of the brain, aka the nervous system, and the sensations that the trauma basically lives in, so to speak, and which is what results in PTSD like symptoms and flashbacks. So basically it's like a form of, getting hurt and then going through physical therapy for it or getting it massaged as opposed to just medicating it or putting some ice on it, which is why it feels intense, but it addresses the root cause.
Oh, okay.
That's
That's really
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
I've like not I haven't heard of that therapy before. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is kind of just like as a last question, because you mentioned like trauma a lot, and I know like especially like in the South Asian community, like intergenerational trauma plays a large role. So maybe could you explain to, oh, sorry, could you explain to our viewers what intergenerational trauma is?
Okay, so according to the American Psychological Association, then intergenerational trauma is the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next in the form of different, symptoms, and it doesn't matter whether you experience the trauma that your ancestors experienced or not, it still lives in your DNA, is what the intergenerational trauma framework argues, and then therefore causes mental and physical health challenges alike.
Oh, okay. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah.
And so that was like our last question. And thank, oh yeah.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Yeah.
And we appreciated like all your responses. It was really eye-opening, and especially like a lot of it I didn't know. So I think I learned a lot, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and then thank you because I think your narrative is just super interesting, and it's also very inspirational how you like wrote the book and you decided to
Help
channel your
people
own
with their stories.
struggles.
Yeah.
Yeah, to advocate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if it is about other people's stories, you'll still hear me telling my story on platforms such as these.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's really
Yeah.
nice.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. That's going to be it for our episode today.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for participating.
Yeah. Hope you have a great day.
Yeah,
You
we hope
too.
you have a nice rest of your summer.